like a Hellcat.
Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another Sega Saturn review, with today's game being Rise 2 Resurrection, which saw release early in 1996 on the Saturn, the PlayStation and the PC, with the PC getting a director's cut several months later, and it was a sequel to the original game known as Rise of the Robots, which came out towards the end of 1994 on various Amiga formats plus the Super Nintendo, before coming out on many other systems the following year like the Game Gear, the Mega Drive, the 3DO, the DOS and the CDI. Now, like always, we'll be talking about how it looks, how it sounds, how it plays, content and lifespan, whether it's still worth playing today, and if it's got the quality to make the Saturn top 10, or if it's so bad it ends up featuring in our Sega Saturn worst 10. So once the main menu comes around, you've only got a very few choice of options here. You've got simply start game, setup, check the high scores, and go through the credits. Now in the setup, you can do standard stuff, change the difficulty, change the language, change the round timers, adjust your volumes, listen to the musical tracks, and check your control pad configuration. Like always, we're going to start with visuals first, and I can't deny the first ever time I played Rise 2 Resurrection, the thing that struck me straight away visually with this game was the pre-rendered backdrop simply just being still images with absolutely no animation or nothing going on in any of them, and it makes every single stage feel very drab, dull and lifeless, and it just gives the game a really bad vibe right from the get-go. In terms of the actual pre-rendered character models, they don't look too bad. The animations are okay. I don't really have any issues with the way it runs in terms of that regard. I don't feel any of the moves look particularly great. Even the special moves don't look that impressive, and it's really disappointing because this game at this point in time was up against games like Street Fighter Alpha, Golden Axe the Duel, the Mortal Kombat games. You know, it had really stiff competition visually, and it just doesn't stand out in any way. It just simply looks so boring and so miserable, I feel, in every regard graphically. As well as that, I feel sometimes when your characters are both jumping at the same time, it does slow down slightly, and there's no excuse for this because there's very little going on each stage. So I feel overall visually this is definitely right up there as one of the least impressive fighting games on the Saturn. Now moving on to the sound effects next, and unfortunately Rise 2 sounds just as dull as it looks, and it was really disappointing for me. I don't really recall any sound effects that stood out within this game that gave me a wow factor, and I feel with robotic based fighters you've got so much more scope to come up with incredible sound effects of metal machines smashing or shooting each other, and this game pretty much just falls flat on its face in that regard. Now going on to the music is better, and it's not offensive and it's not terrible in any way, shape or form, and you've actually got a track on this game composed by Brian May of Queen as well, but for me most of the tracks feel like they'd be more well suited to a racing game like Wipeout. They've kind of got this futuristic racing style feel to them, and I don't really feel they're that well suited to this game. But again, like I said, the music isn't terrible, and I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who actually think the soundtrack for this game is relatively good. So what I'll do is give you a few examples so you can decide for yourselves. So moving on to the gameplay next, and if you've watched some of my videos in the past, you may well have heard me say that for as bad as the game looks or as poor as it sounds, it may still play well and be enjoyable. But unfortunately for Rise 2, that principle can't be applied here because it simply plays as you'd probably expect it to based on the visuals and the sound, and that is not particularly good. You've got a familiar 6-button layout as well as a super meter that fills up as you battle, similar to lots of the other 2D fighters of the era, but unfortunately the quality of the gameplay is nowhere near the likes of Street Fighter Alpha, Darkstalkers, or even Golden Axe Duel. The game feels pretty stiff and robotic to play, and it isn't particularly very smooth either. The master characters have got several special moves. The instruction manual only lists 2 moves per characters and tells you that you should simply try and learn the rest of the special moves for each characters, as well as their grapple, super moves and executions by guessing the inputs. The downside with this is the fact that as the game isn't enjoyable to play, you won't want to invest the time trying to figure out all of the possible moves for each of the characters within the game, and even on the off chance that you figure out how to do an execution move, they don't actually look that impressive anyway. So overall in the gameplay department, I feel Rise 2 Resurrection leaves you feeling pretty underwhelmed and disappointed. So moving on to content and lifespan next, and we've got 18 selectable characters at the start of the game, and there are additional ones that can be unlocked as well, meaning the roster is quite large. The downside though is the fact that you don't feel any personal connection to any of the characters whatsoever. There's no storyline material as you play through the one-player game. There's no biographies for any of the characters either, so they all feel pretty lifeless, and the fact that we've only simply got an arcade mode as well compounds the lifespan and the content further, because there really isn't much to come back to when you play through it, because it's not enjoyable to play. Yes, you can have 2-player battles, but there's no variety in the single-player experience. It's simply arcade mode, and that is it. We don't even have a practice mode for you to practice your special moves and combos on. The only way you can do that is if you set up a 2-player match and just leave the second player standing there. And it's just really, really frustrating overall. The game brings no enjoyment in the gameplay, and that really, really hinders any game's content and lifespan. So overall in this department, you guessed it, it doesn't perform very well. So like always, that leaves us with our 2 final questions. Is Rise 2 Resurrection still worth playing today? And today's final question is, does it make our Sega Saturn bottom 10? Because quite clearly it's nowhere near the best 10 games on the system. As for whether it's worth playing, unfortunately not. Whether it's a 1-player or a 2-player experience, the game falls flat on its face. The really boring, drab visuals and the slightly frustrating and uninspired gameplay mean it's just not a game you're going to want to play. Now, where does it feature in the bottom 10 should be the question, because it features quite highly. It's coming in at number 5 as the 5th worst game that I've looked at. There's a few games above it. Obviously the Crow City of Angels is by far the worst game I've looked at on the system, but Virtual Open Tennis and Breakpoint Tennis were both pretty poor, and Striker 96 is a really bad football game as well. So this, in my eyes, so far is the 5th worst game that I have looked at on the system. But of course, these are just my thoughts and my thoughts alone. Do your thoughts differ, I should say, for Rise 2, or do you agree with me that it is just a really bad fighting game? Without a doubt, the worst fighting game that I have looked at on the system so far. Let me know your thoughts down below, and like always, I'll be back in the near future with another review. Goodbye for now.